Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Tesla Hertz deal or no deal situation. Then we've got another rental car update. We've got an official recall of Tesla's FSD Beta from that rollback last weekend with actually some pretty interesting new information in that. And we've got some new updates to Tesla's design studio. Tesla has added a bit of range. And we've got a couple updates on Berlin and Texas. Tesla today just absolutely plummeting all the way back to the second highest close of all time. Saying that in jest, obviously, but obviously Tesla down a bit today, 3% to $1,171.97, while the Nasdaq was up about 1/3%. I think a lot of the drop being attributed to some of the Hertz news today, which we'll talk about in a second. Certainly possible, but it's also possible that it had to do with the FSD Beta recall, with the fact that Tesla's been up 50% in the last month, especially because tomorrow Fed Chairman Jerome Powell at about 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time will be giving an update on the latest Federal Reserve meeting. With such a big and fast run-up, some traders may just not want to hold through an event like that. So yeah, maybe this Hertz stuff did play a role, but probably a combination of all of these things. So with that said, let's get into the Hertz news, which really isn't that big of news. Elon Musk last night replying to a thank you for Tesla stock price saying, quote, "You're welcome. If any of this is based on Hertz, I'd like to emphasize that no contract has been signed yet. Tesla has far more demand than production. Therefore, we will only sell cars to Hertz for the same margin as to consumers. Hertz deal has zero effect on our economics," end quote. So I think most of us understand what Elon is trying to get across here. He had already expressed a pretty similar message previously. He's really just reiterating that there's no discounts here. And him saying that there's no contract, that's very different than saying that there's no order. There's clearly an order. Hertz is clearly all in based on their press releases, CEO comments. They're obviously very high budget ad campaign, which they've already started pretty significantly. So Hertz is obviously confident that they're getting the cars. They could pivot, but they're not going to. They're in on this. And even if the deal did somehow fall apart, Tesla's going to sell those cars either way. What's important about the Hertz orders is couplefold. First, just the signals that it carries. We talked about all that when the announcement happened, basically the sign from another business that Tesla is the optimal choice. So whether an order goes through or not, those signals still remain. The other part, obviously, is that just having this number of vehicles in a rental fleet is great exposure for Tesla for the future. And that obviously would be a downside if an order like this didn't end up going through. That being said, it's really inconsequential because Hertz, for their part today, said, quote, "As we announced last week, Hertz has made an initial order of 100,000 Tesla electric vehicles and is investing in new EV charging infrastructure across the company's global operations. Deliveries of the Teslas already have started. We are seeing very strong early demand for Teslas in our rental fleet, which reflects market demand for Tesla vehicles," end quote. So Hertz, they're saying, yep, we ordered 100,000 vehicles. And just as a reminder, when this news initially came out, while Elon did tweet that it was strange that it moved the valuation, he didn't deny that there was an order of 100,000 vehicles or anything like that. So it's very obvious that there's an order and that Tesla is the party that is in the immense position of strength here on any other details of a contract between the companies or a contract between the three companies if we loop in Uber as well. So as I said, this is really a positive, and worst case is just a neutral thing that Elon is saying here. As for what other elements remain, if Elon is saying that no contract has been signed yet, implying that one would be, if Tesla's not going to negotiate on price, there are other things to figure out like time of vehicle delivery, the structure of any fleet management software, what they're going to do with charging, when and how these vehicles are going to be delivered, and any document or destination fees that may come along with those orders, which is an area that could be justifiably different than a consumer delivery due to scale. Remember, Elon said same margin, not necessarily the exact same revenue. Elsewhere in the rental world today, we actually had some probably more interesting news, and that was Avis's earnings report. They ended up beating earnings expectations by about 60%, beat revenue, and announced a $1 billion share buyback. And their short interest is pretty high, about 15% of outstanding shares, higher percent of float. So maybe a bit of a short squeeze going on there today, though the stock did drop off from the highs of the morning. Anyway, the main point is that it's kind of interesting to keep an eye on these Hertz competitors as we watch to see if maybe they'll announce some similar moves. And Avis was asked specifically about this on their earnings call today. So here's that clip.
Great, thank you. And then for my follow-up, could you just walk us through how you're thinking about your electric vehicle strategy for your fleet, and if that's a focus, and why haven't you moved there earlier?
Yeah, sure. Ryan, it's Brian here, and I'll start and Joe can add color. So we at Avis realized that the electrification of vehicles is where not just our industry, but the entire mobility ecosystem is eventually headed. And I think the bold move made by one of our competitors and that announcement is good for the overall rental car industry. It pushes pace and draws attention to what needs to be done to absorb electric vehicles at scale. I don't think it's fair to characterize that we haven't moved on this. Like, we've spent a lot of time over the past 12 months with both our OEM partners to optimize a product line for electric vehicles, and also our infrastructure partners to tackle logistical hurdles about, like I said, absorbing these vehicles at scale. So we are definitely moving forward on this front. But the reason you haven't heard from us publicly on this is because of competitive reasons. We'd like to execute on our strategy before announcing it.
All right, so kind of a couple things there. First off, just kind of had to chuckle at that dig at Hertz there at the end about executing before announcing. But obviously, Avis here saying, yes, electrification is where things are headed. We are very interested in that and working on things. And if you tie that together with what Hertz interim CEO Mark Fields said, which was that, quote, Tesla is the only manufacturer that can produce EVs at scale, end quote, well, those two things in combination start to get pretty interesting. Even with Tesla at scale, it's looking challenging enough for Hertz to get these vehicles as quickly as they want them. So if you're a Hertz competitor, you might be sitting there and looking at that and saying, well, maybe we want to jump on something a little bit sooner rather than later. Especially if this EV tax credit goes through, then demand is just going to get even more out of control. So there might start to be a little bit of pressure being applied there, and Avis there even acknowledged that this move does help push things forward. Part of that is because of that pressure. And you can see some of that materializing already just by the fact that this question was asked on the earnings call. We're definitely heading into a very interesting period of time right now. All right, next up here, we did end up getting an official recall that Tesla has filed with NHTSA in regards to the FSD Beta, a little bit of a mishap that happened last weekend where 10.3 was pushed, then there were some issues, and then it was rolled back, and some people lost access to the beta for a little bit, and they rolled 10.3.1, and at that point, all was well. But because 10.3 did not work as intended, Tesla did have to file a recall, and this time I do actually agree with that. Unlike what I found to be a silly inquiry by NHTSA in regards to Tesla not issuing a recall for the addition of emergency vehicle recognition and adjustment to autopilot based on that. That was adding something additional that was never there and was never claimed to be there. This was fixing a mistake. Anyway, of course we know that Tesla has resolved this with an over-the-air update. Still have to file the recall anyway. More thoughts on that in a second, but there are some interesting details in here because they had to do that. First of which is the number of vehicles affected. So that's 11,704. So we now know that Tesla is up from about 2,000 people with the FSD Beta to presumably that 11,700 number, at least as of 10.3. And of course that number has grown since. So this is starting to be a pretty significant number of cars. And one of the interesting things that Zach Kirkhorn said on Tesla's Q3 call was that about 150,000 people had the safety score, which means had either requested FSD Beta or were in Texas and used it for Tesla insurance in Texas. Kind of tough to estimate how that split falls, but maybe 5 to 10% or so of the people that have requested beta then so far had received it as of last weekend. The rest of the recall does kind of walk through what the issue was. So Tesla says, as Elon said on Twitter, that when waking up from either Sentry mode or some in standby mode, one of the chips in the dual FSD computer chip architecture would be in a low power mode. That would then result in a communication disconnect, and that could lead to false forward collision warnings or automatic emergency braking events. The recall then shares the chronology of how this all unfolded, and I won't go through that line by line, but it's really interesting to see how quickly Tesla was able to react and get this problem solved. Even though the communication on it wasn't necessarily perfect, they did resolve this really quickly. Regardless, they do still have to do the recall, and the most ridiculous part about this is that they have to send out letters and that owners will be notified on December 28th, despite the fact that of these 11,700 vehicles, only 17 haven't updated to the resolved software version. So I don't know if only 17 will get the letters or if it's all 11,700, but if it's the latter, that's a process that I'd love to see Tesla and NHTSA work together on fixing. I mean, what a waste that is for an over-the-air update. Tesla should just be able to tell owners through the vehicle that, hey, there's this recall and it's resolved with this software, as should any other automaker that's doing over-the-air updates. So that's the news on the recall. Again, no real issue with the recall itself, but obviously the media is going to cover it completely differently than what the actual scenario is here. So, I mean, that's annoying, but I guess par for the course for media. All right, next, Tesla has made a couple of updates in the design studio, primarily to the vehicle ranges on the Model 3 and the Model Y. So quick summary of those changes. Tesla has increased the range by 10 miles on the rear-wheel drive Model 3 from 262 now to 272 miles, but the acceleration has declined a bit. So the 0 to 60 has dropped from 5.3 seconds before now to 5.8 seconds. Tesla has also dropped the Standard Range Plus moniker for that version, so it's now just Model 3. Makes it a little tricky for me, but I'll probably still call it either the Standard Range or just rear-wheel drive. Anyway, the long-range Model 3 also saw a slight bump in range from 353 miles before, now to 358, but no changes on the performance. Pretty similar for the Model Y, the long range has been bumped up from 326 miles to 330, and no change on the performance. There's also a small design tweak. Tesla has now made the estimated delivery time show up consistently. Regardless of where you're at on the page, it will now just scroll along with you in the top right corner. With the big backlog, this makes it a bit easier to see how individual options changes could affect your delivery date. So overall, kind of an interesting set of changes. Obviously, the biggest being to the standard range or the rear-wheel drive Model 3. Could be a signal that all of that production is going to be lithium iron phosphate, and that could be why the 0 to 60 time slowed down as well. But then why are we also seeing the range bump for the long-range versions? And then why also are we not seeing it bump up for performance if the long range does? So not a super intuitive mix of updates here from Tesla. So hopefully we'll find out if the base versions are lithium iron phosphate Model 3s, but other than that, pretty inconsequential updates. Next, we've got a couple of pieces of news on both Giga Berlin and Giga Texas. We'll start off with Berlin. Elon today lamenting the decision which we had discussed a couple weeks back about moving the public commentary period, effectively delaying any final approval based on Brandenburg officials' uncertainty on if there had been enough notice given for that previous period. Anyway, Elon today commenting on that, saying, "Sigh, what they're doing is just not right." Anyway, as we had previously talked about, that period starts today and will run through November 22nd. We'll have to wait until sometime after that for approval for Berlin to start production. Bit more of an exciting update for Giga Texas. Jeff Roberts, who does drone flyover videos there, sharing today a few images of some containers coming in. And if you look closely on the side of the containers, they are labeled anode line 1 and cathode line 1. So presumably this would be 4680 battery manufacturing equipment. Some people interpreting that as a good sign that Tesla has honed in on their process now, which it could be, but if you go back a few quarterly earnings calls, Zach Kirkhorn did mention that Tesla was already ordering equipment ahead of time. And if you think about the lead time for stuff like this, it's obviously going to take some time for that equipment to come in. So I wouldn't necessarily draw that same conclusion, but either way, very exciting to see this equipment coming in. Anyway, that is where we'll leave it for today. So as always, thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed and signed up for notifications. You can also find me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast. And I'll see you tomorrow for the Wednesday, November 3rd episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.